So I got interested in this topic of the 7 deadly sins some years ago, in part because I focus a lot of my research on one of them, anger. And in the categories of the 7 deadly sins, you always find discussions of anger, wrath. There's a lot of different words that are used for that. And I got interested in this in part because I wanted to look at treatments of anger across theology and across philosophy. So some of the people who talk a lot about it locate it within the context of the 7 deadly sins. And when I started researching this, I found this guy, John Cassian, who is one of the people that's going to show up in the story that I'm going to lead you through. And instead of talking about the 7 deadly sins, which I'd heard about since I was a kid, he talked about the 8 capital vices. So I thought, well, that's a little bit odd. How did we go from 8 down to 7? And why is it capital vices instead of deadly sins? And as I started looking into it, I found that there were a lot of different transitions that took place. And from being interested in Cassian's treatment of anger, I started getting interested in some of the treatments of the other things that he was talking about. For example, he listed sadness among tristitia in Latin, among the capital vices. Well, that's kind of strange too. I mean, when we think of the 7 deadly sins, we think of things like envy and pride and anger and greed and lust. We don't think of being sad as a problem. We think of that as like, somebody's angry at me and hurts me, then I get to be sad. So why would Cassian consider that to be among these precursors of the deadly sins? So as I looked into this, it's one of those sort of topics where the more that you pull at the threads, the more it starts to unravel and other threads start coming with it. And I'm still nowhere near where I'd like to be in my research on this. You keep on finding more and more discussions of people arranging these, focusing on these. But after a while, some things do become clear from this almost cacophony of voices talking about sins and how to classify them. Certain themes and certain preoccupations show themselves to be, you might say structural. They're there determining what's actually going on. So before I actually talk about what is a deadly sin or a capital vice, I want to talk a little bit about 4 approaches that are taken to these sins or these vices. And the people that are interested in talking about this and thinking about this sort of stuff, they have very specific things in mind. There are reasons why they are thinking about this, writing about this, preaching about it, trying to live it out. They have to do with what it is that their function is. Are they a monk? Are they somebody who has to hear confessions? Are they a poet? Are they a university professor? Those are the 4 types of characters that show up in the stories I'm going to tell. There's others too, artists, but I'm not going to talk about artists because we don't have the time to talk about all the different iconography of this sort of thing. These people were interested in identifying the key complexes and producers of many sins. So if you think about this basic idea, how many ways can a human being go wrong? Is it just 7? Is it 700? Is it almost infinite? Aristotle said, it's almost infinite. And that was back before Christianity showed up and said some things that you Greeks are saying are okay are not okay anymore. Probably right about that, by the way. If you can figure out what are the main causes for people being screwed up, then you have a better shot at helping them not to be screwed up, and helping them to make progress in their lives, whether it's temporal or spiritual. Another thing that was going on is these people were condensing human experience. These are all very smart people who are talking and writing about these bad traits. And they're looking at what's going on around them. They're not academics in the sort of sense that you're used to, where people often think of it as a sort of an ivory tower and detached from day-to-day reality. It's not actually the case. Just follow any university professor around for a day, you'll find out that's not the case. But that's a conception we have. These were people who had to live in monasteries with a bunch of other monks who are oftentimes no fun and deal with teaching children brought to the monastery because that's the only place to study. Or with, being called on by the emperor to come and be his counselor, as Alcuin had to. Or being stuck being pope against your will, like Gregory I, who just wanted to be a Benedictine monk and leave all that sort of stuff behind. So these are people who are trying to take what they see going on and the wisdom of generations and think about this in the light of Christian doctrine. So when we lose this kind of context, then the 7 deadly sins become kind of trivialized. If you go online, you'll find, and just type in 7 deadly sins. You'll get a Wikipedia article, of course, right? It'll pop up at the top. And that's interesting. But you'll get a whole bunch of other things, like the 7 deadly sins of media communications, and the 7 deadly sins of selling cars, and the 7 deadly sins of this, and the 7 deadly sins of that. There's a lot of images. There's a 7 deadly sins of websites, and you can actually see them. I forget what was what. Like there's some food thing, that's the gluttony one. What was the anger one? I can't remember offhand. Some pornography site is the lust one, of course. YouTube is in there. Facebook is the one for envy. A lot of this makes sense. But if we get away from the actual context, it just turns into like, well, there's these 7 bad characteristics, and we'll see how we can fit things in. And it gets very forced. You'll also find a lot of artwork where there's 7 women, and the one who's envy, how do you know she's envy? Because she's in green. And the one who's lust is purple. And the one who's anger, what do you think she is?
Red.
Yeah, of course, red, right? She's not going to be yellow or something like that. There's a kind of standard iconography, but it gets kind of flattened out. These people were really thinking about this stuff. So there's 4 main contexts. The first context is these desert monks out there in Egypt primarily, also somewhat in Palestine. And they're trying to reflect on how do we get screwed up? Being screwed up keeps us from being able to love our neighbor and to love God and put ourselves on the right path. What are the ways in which we get screwed up? How does that take place? How can we keep that from happening? What they had to say gets taken on by a lot of other people. Then early on, there's also a poetic context. Around the same time as these monks are writing about this, there's a Latin poet, Prudentius, who writes about sins. Not exactly the same as the other ones, but he does some important things. Then much later, after the 4th Lateran Council, there's this incredible emphasis on going to confession. And that everybody has to go to confession once a year, which means that somebody's got to hear all those confessions, right? A lot of people see it as, oh, the poor laity, they have to go to confession. Think about that poor priest who's stuck hearing all these confessions, because these are people who are actually coming to him and expecting some sort of guidance. They're revealing how they're screwed up. And this guy, who probably doesn't have that much training, has to give advice that will actually help these people out. So there were people who wrote books to try to help them do this better. There's a few interesting things that, little excessive things that happen with that we'll talk about. And then there's this scholastic context. As you guys all know from your history classes, the universities develop in some major towns like Paris, and Paris is where you would go to study theology, and you would study theology there primarily so you could go be a priest somewhere else. And people like Thomas Aquinas, who I know you've all heard of, but other scholastics are also thinking about the sins. So what is a deadly sin? Why should we call some sins deadly? Isn't that kind of overkill? What do you think? I mean, it's not like if you feel pride, you're automatically going to hell. Or you're going to die. Like, we do that in movies. Like, remember Seven? Have you guys all seen Seven? This guy's punishing these people, and at the very end, Brad Pitt has to become Wrath, cap it all off. Well, it's not quite like that. It's not quite so straightforward as, well, I'm lazy, so somebody's going to tie me to a bed. Yeah.
It's kind of like if you let those 7 things consume your whole life, never will.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Each of them has a tendency to seduce us, to lead us into thinking, that's not that big of a deal. And then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And they also are things that lead to other mistakes. They're productive of other ways of getting things wrong. So if I have a terrible temper, what are some of the things I'm liable to do that aren't directly anger, but come from the anger? Yeah.
Violence.
Yeah, I'll engage in violence against other people, take revenge for imagined insults, slander people, feel rancor within myself, be a jerk in general, and make everybody uncomfortable. I mean, we could go down a whole list, right? Everyone knows what it's like to be angry and what excessive anger looks like. So each of these can be understood not only in terms of ways in which we go wrong, but also in terms of another concept which gets brought in, virtue. You guys all, probably run into this in your intro to philosophy class or in an ethics class. You heard something about what virtue is. Virtues are good character traits. And within the Christian framework, they absorbed the concept of virtues like justice, courage, prudence, temperance that the ancients before them were talking about. And then they talked about theological virtues like faith and hope and charity as being states that you wanted to cultivate within yourself. It's not enough just to do the right thing. You want to actually have the right sort of frame of mind. You want to have the right habits. You want to be the right kind of person. And these sins are things which gnaw away at or block or interfere with our development of the virtues. So let's move on and let's talk about the 8 deadly sins, the 8 capital vices. At the start, there's 8, and they're not actually vices, they're actually thoughts. The first guy who talks about this is a monk named Evagrius Ponticus. And he's a guy who starts out in Palestine and wants a more rigorous, monastic experience, so he goes out in the desert. Monachos originally means solitary person. Comes from Greek. And the first monks would go out in the desert, and why would they do that? Because they just couldn't stand people. That wasn't that. They wanted to remove distractions so they could pray, so they could contemplate, so they could cultivate a life with God. And how well do you think that went? Just take a guess. You have an intention of I'm going to get away from it all, and I'll just hang out and say my psalter and pray, and God will be with me. And I'll have food and water and stuff like that. I don't have to worry about that and clothing. It didn't actually go that well in a lot of cases. In part because you bring to the desert yourself. And if you're screwed up, if you have flaws within you, like John Cassian will say later, you can take your anger out in the desert, and instead of getting angry at people, you're going to get angry at rocks. You're going to get angry at other things. Because you've brought the anger with you. If you have greed, if you have lust, if you have gluttony, you're going to bring those things with you. And Ponticus, and this is on one of the handouts that I created for you, he talks about the 8 thoughts, logismoi in Greek. These thoughts are things that get suggested to us. And we're particularly suggestible creatures. And in his view, it's demons, the fallen angels, that are suggesting these thoughts to us. And if we resist them, we're okay. If we give in to them, they wound our soul, and they take a root inside of us, and they steer us into doing bad things. Not like they take over it, and make us possessed, or like they turn us into a mechanism. They have us actually doing the wrong thing by our own choice. And so he talks about 8 of these. And many of these you'll recognize from the list of the 7 deadly sins. There's gluttony, there's lust or sexual immorality, literally in Greek just wickedness, pomerias, sadness, lupes, anger, and then one that's not translated that we call Acedia. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. Vainglory, kenodoxia, literally like empty, making too much of oneself, and then finally pride. And any of these can attack us during our lives. And if we don't resist them, then they will start steering us to go in different directions. We're susceptible to that. They actually tap into different parts of our soul. So the lower parts are subject to lust or gluttony. The part of us that's actually dynamic, that seeks out honor, part of us in which courage can be located, can also become angry, can also become dejected and despairing. Even the mind itself is subject to pride and vainglory, to thinking too much of oneself for the wrong reasons. And what he tells us about these is anger, he says, is the sharpest of the passions, the one that actually infects the very faculty by which we should resist evil. We're given this ability to fight in order to resist evil. But what anger does is it doesn't help, it seduces us into actually using that to fight against our neighbors, or fight against ourselves, or fight against God. And Acedia is called the noonday devil. This comes from a psalm where they talk about the devil who stalks around at noonday. And the monks very early on recognize that there's a kind of restlessness, a kind of inability to stick to things and get things done. You all know that from being students, right? When you have an assignment to do or something to read and you read over it a bit. I do this too. And you get to the end of the passage and you realize you haven't paid any attention to what you're reading. That can be Acedia. When you can't stay in your room and focus on your tasks and you start going around looking what everyone else is doing, not because you're envious of them, but because you just want to know what they're doing, maybe to even help them out. That can be Acedia. That distracts you from your tasks and keeps you from being able to persevere. And he says this is actually the most heavy of the demons or thoughts. And then vainglory and pride are particularly problematic. Why do you think that is? If I'm a glutton, if I want to eat too much or drink too much or indulge myself in sensual appetite too much, that's pretty easy to tell, right? I mean, just watch for a while, you get fat, right? Unless you get some sort of screwed up metabolism or a tapeworm or something like that. Lust, that's pretty easy to watch too, And you know that these things are bad. Pride and vainglory come in and they use the things that are good about you to make too much of yourself. So let's say you conquer your anger. And that's a tough thing to do. Any of you who struggle with anger problems. You conquer your anger. Now you can become prideful about that. Now you can think that you should probably write books about anger. You should go on a tour. You should go to, if you're a monk, you should go around to all the other monks and help them straighten out their anger problem. And when you do that, they're going to say, what a swell person you are. And you can start imagining how this is going to work. And you're getting higher and higher and higher. That's vainglory. That's what he's talking about there. So these are all things we can relate to, I think. Right? These monks, their experience is not that far off from us. So that's Evagrius Ponticus. John Cassian comes a little bit later, and he writes a lot more about this stuff. And instead of talking about it in terms of thoughts, he talks about it in terms of vices, character traits that become established in us because we act in certain ways. When we give in to the desire to eat and eat and eat, that becomes stronger as a desire, right? It doesn't go away when we satisfy it. When we give in to the desire to take revenge for being slighted through anger, we often say, I just have to, let my anger be dispensed on something. we're actually making ourselves worse. It becomes harder the next time to resist it. And so Cassian talks about this in two very important documents, the Institutes and then these conferences. The conferences are coming from Cassian actually going out in the desert himself. He started out in the West. He travels east with his friend. He wants to become a monk, and sort of like if you want to go to the best schools, you go to the best monasteries to learn how to be a monk. He goes to the ones in Palestine, and like Evagrius Ponticus decides this isn't rigorous enough for me. They go down to Egypt, and he spends time going around and staying at these monasteries and talking to the abbots, the guys who are in charge, and saying, well, how do you guys actually do this? What's working for you? What's not working for you? Sort of like quality testing in business terms. And out of this comes a whole set of books. And he talks about these vices as well. And I'm not going to say too much about that. What I do want to say is that Cassian he goes back to the West, and he writes these books. And he gets recommended as required reading, by St. Benedict, who organizes the Benedictine order. This is a very fateful move, because that means that all these Benedictine monks, if they're actually paying attention, and many of them were not, we know this from actually reading what Benedictine monks wrote about other Benedictine monks, they're coming into contact with this notion. There are these 8 capital vices. Here's what they are, here's what they look like, here's how you fight against them, here's how they're connected to each other, here's how, for example, gluttony gives rise to lust, because when you're full and you've had enough to eat, then it's a lot easier to start thinking about having sex all the time, and pride can give rise to envy, can give rise to anger, can give rise to dejection, all these sorts of things. This is very useful information for them to have. So one of the very important people in the Benedictine order, and now we're moving ahead in time quite a bit, to Gregory I, so we're now in the 6th century. Gregory I becomes a pope, against his wishes. He's one of those kind of guys who is living at a terrible time when it's hard to get good help, and he is good help. And he's great at organizing things, he's really smart, and what he'd really like to do is just be in his monastery and pray and be left alone, but they make him pope. And back then it wasn't, there weren't a lot of perks for being pope. Really, it's kind of a bad job to get stuck with for almost anybody. I know I certainly could do anything remotely like that. Gregory writes a book called Moralia in Job, which means an interpretation of the book of Job, wisdom literature, in a moral sense. And in it, he has a passage where he talks about the 7 deadly sins. Now you notice we went from 8 to 7, right? He actually does talk about the 8 capital vices, but he changes things around a bit. He says, pride is the root, the ruling vice of all of these others. Pride is like, he's actually commenting on some scripture verses. He smelleth the battle far off, which is in the book of Job, and the exhortation of the captains and the howling of the army. So there's a lot of military metaphors going on there. Pride is like the general. And what do generals have? Soldiers down at the bottom, right? But is that all there is? Who's over the soldiers and under the general? You don't just have that one guy saying, do this, do that, because he can't possibly pay attention to everybody. You have captains, or, majors, pick whatever rank you want, right? They use the term captains in this. Pride is the sin, the vice, that flows into these 7 other vices, which then flow into many others. Pride is, he says, the queen of sins. And when it occupies the heart, it surrenders it to these 7 principal vices or sins. Each of these brings its own forces, and these lead to each other. Gregory also mentions that we have to be very careful not to allow our virtues, the good things about us, to be turned into pride. Because if we do, we're lost. And he's writing this not just to monks, but also to lay people, because he's a pope. We have to be careful not to allow good traits about ourselves like justice to turn into cruelty, or zeal into anger, or gentleness into sloth. So he's telling us some very interesting things about this. What's most important for the story that I'm telling you here is now there's 7 sins. And if you look at the sins that he talks about, he didn't just say, well, pride we're going to put over here, and then we'll look at these 7. He also changed some of the sins around. He keeps gluttony and keeps lust and keeps greed. Those will stay in the entire time. But what does he actually take out? He rolls sadness and Acedia into one single vice, sadness, tristitia, allowing oneself to feel despair, to be distracted, to not actually focus on the things that one needs to focus on. And he brings in a new one, envy. Before that, some of these guys would talk about envy, but envy wasn't one of the major vices. It takes a while for this to stick. We can see that, for instance, Alcuin, who's writing several centuries after Gregory, goes back to the 8 capital vices. Other monks, for example, Hugh of St. Victor, use Gregory's things. There's a guy, Isidore of Seville, a very literate guy in Spain, as Spain is starting to go into the Dark Ages, who writes a number of books, one of which is called the Sententiae, or the Summa Bono, on the highest good. And he actually talks about the 7 deadly sins the way that Gregory does. He also does something that's very important. He starts talking about virtues opposing sins. So for each sin, each vice, there is a virtue that combats it. Later on, Hugh of St. Victor, he's going to write a book called 5 Sevens, literally. And one of those 7s is the 7 deadly sins. Now they're starting to think about, well, what can we do to actually resist these? What are some of the other things? 7 virtues to oppose them. 7 passages from Scripture. The Our Father. 7 parts of that. Attack the different sins. 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. They start really getting into this number 7, in other words, and seeing a lot of parallels. They're helped out, and now I have to backtrack a little bit, by this poet Prudentius. And Prudentius writes a book called the Psychomachia, and that means the fight for the soul. And if you ever have a chance to read it, because it's very gory, and a lot of funny things happen in it. And the vices, and they're not exactly the same thing, or the sins, they're not exactly the same list that Gregory's using. They fight against the virtues. And so, first it's faith versus worship of the old gods, and then it's chastity versus lust. And they tussle for a while, and then chastity actually kills lust. And then patience goes into the list against wrath, and wrath brings every weapon possible. And these are all women too, by the way, fighting. And wrath is like slicing at patience and trying to destroy her, and getting even angrier and angrier and angrier. And finally, all of her weapons break, and she dies. She dies by her own hand. And then there's other little things that happen. Pride comes along and is riding on this great horse and saying to all of them, "There's no way you can resist me." And then she falls into a pit that was actually dug by one of the other vices. Greed comes along and pretends to be thrift and almost takes them unaware. And then finally, the very last battle, discord attacks and starts turning them against each other. And then finally, concord or harmony turns up and sticks her in the heart, and it's all over. Now, why is all this kind of may sound, my rendition a little silly. Why is this important? Because you have personification of the different vices and the different virtues fighting against each other. It is literally a battle for the soul, the human soul. This is going to influence artistic representations and what the monks are thinking and all these other people. Now I'm going to speed the story up a little bit, because I don't want to keep you over time, and I do want to have time for questions. I'm actually going to skip over talking about who doesn't think in terms of the seven. There's a lot of important medieval authors who don't actually address that. Anselm is one that I particularly like. He talks in terms of pride being a river that flows into three other rivers, and he's getting this from Augustine's emphasis on the three types of desire, that can lead us astray: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. So what Anselm is saying fits into that. Not everybody bought into that, but one of the things that happens that really affects this story, that brings the seven deadly sins into real prominence, probably the reason why we talk about them today still, is in the Fourth Lateran Council, it's decided that everybody has to go to confession once a year. Which, like I said before, that means some poor priest has to hear all these people's confessions once a year. Everybody above a certain age. And these priests need some sort of guidance on how to figure out what's wrong with these people and what's wrong with their behavior and what are the root causes of this, so they can give them some useful advice. And they also need to figure out how serious are the sins that these people are engaged in. Because once people start going to confession, they start to actually worry about this kind of thing. Maybe the first time they go, they're like, yeah, I did this and I did that. This is just pro forma. But then they start thinking about it. They start thinking, yeah, actually, I am kind of a bad guy. I better get my act together. I don't want to go to hell. Maybe I don't even want to screw up my life here. And so they need to know how serious these things are. So you have these people, and by this time new orders have arisen. It's not a Benedictine thing. It's largely a Dominican and Franciscan thing. A lot of the Dominicans start writing these manuals for confessors. Sort of like a guidebook. How to hear somebody's confession. And they can get pretty detailed. And they use the seven deadly sins as a kind of rubric. Sort of like you might use them to organize PowerPoint when you're putting together a presentation. It provides them with they're not engaging in a lot of analysis of psychology or anything like that, what's really going on with the human being. That's going to happen with the scholastic authors. These people are interested in a very practical purpose. And so you get these guys like Raymond Pennefort and William Peyrolt and John of Friedberg, all writing these books that are going to become influential not only on priests but even on poets later on. Geoffrey Chaucer incorporates some of this. You guys know from the Canterbury Tales. At the same time, the universities are arising. Before that, schooling is largely taking place in the monasteries and at the cathedrals. When the universities arise, you have a new way of approaching things. There's a lot of things coming together at the same time. One of these things is the rediscovery of Aristotle's texts. They only had a few of them in the early Middle Ages, and then once they get Aristotle's system, which some of you may have encountered in your ethics classes, if you've taken that so far, your intro to philosophy class. Aristotle had a very detailed, worked through classification of the virtues and vices that didn't map onto this stuff. And they're trying to make sense of that. And they're trying to figure out how can we actually classify these things. So, for example, Peter Lombard, who's one of the early guys, he writes this book called The Sentences. And just about everybody who is everybody had to write a commentary on the sentences. Like in your capping classes, you got to write on somebody in your field. That would be your capping class. And Lombard said there's 4 ways to classify sins. Augustine said you could classify them in terms of covetousness or fear and what kind they're coming out of. Jerome, who was another great doctor of the church, said You can think about it in terms of thought, or word, or deed. That's a fundamental classification. Or you can think about who they're against. What makes something a sin? It's against somebody. So it could be against God, or it could be against yourself, or it could be against your neighbor. Or, then he says, you can also do the 7 deadly sins. The list that Gregory gave us, which he got from Cassian and modified from Cassian. So this list is coming through all the way back from these monks into the doctors, the schoolmasters. And they're, Bonaventure appropriates this, all these other guys, William Auxerre. One of the people who's the most important in how he approaches this is Thomas Aquinas. Probably one of the most brilliant of the scholastic doctors. And he spends a lot of time exploring these sins from Gregory's list, and he discusses a lot of ways of dividing the sins. He actually gets into discussions about which is the real root of sin. Is it greed or is it pride? Greed is in a certain way, sort of like a tree is, it's the trunk, and everything is nourished by the sap flowing through it. But then again, pride is the beginning of all of these sins. And then he, looks at how all these sins are contrary to certain virtues. So, he'll discuss vainglory and how it's opposed to genuine courage in a person. Or he'll talk about sloth. And he decides the problem of sloth, too. He says that Cassian was distinguishing sadness from Acedia, but Gregory actually got it right by slurring these things in together. So Thomas kind of gives you a decisive voice on that. But sloth is opposed to genuine love for other people and love for God. Anger. What would anger be opposed to? The monks would have said patience. Thomas Aquinas says temperance, control of one's appetites, is really what's missing in the person who's driven by anger. And he talks also about the daughters of the sins, meaning that each one of these things gives rise. Gregory talked about like each one of them having an army. Aquinas talks in terms of them having daughters. So, for example, envy. What does envy bring about? Hatred, talebearing, saying bad things about people behind their back, detraction, joy at our neighbor's misfortunes, grief for our neighbor's prosperity. These are all bad things to have, and they all come from envy. So if you can attack envy at its root, you can knock out some of this other behavior. The last group of people I want to talk about are the poets. And you notice I talked about Prudentius, and then I didn't talk about anyone else. It's not really until later on that the poets start thinking in terms of the 7 deadly sins. Some people want to try to read it into Beowulf, but there's really not a good argument for that. You can see some of the characters as representing certain things, but the author doesn't say anything like that, and there's no real discussion of it. But Dante. How many of you have read Dante in any of your classes? You read the Inferno, probably, right? Have any of you read the Purgatorio? Yeah. That one actually is more closely connected to the 7 deadly sins. They do show up in the Inferno, because when you start going down, right, after you get past limbo, where the poor saps who didn't have the chance to actually hear the gospel are stuck, even if they're not too bad. And you have the people who are totally indecisive and chase the ever-shifting banner all around as well. We start going into the circles of hell. And the circles of hell start out being organized with the 7 deadly sins. Lust, then gluttony, then greed, then wrath. But then they depart from that, because then it's heresy and violence and fraud and treachery. But when we look at the purgatory, which has an ascending sort of structure to it, you're climbing the mountain. The things that are being purged away at each point are the 7 deadly sins. It's become consolidated by this point. And when somebody like Dante endorses it, that really solidifies it. There were other people. Geoffrey Chaucer. How many of you have read the Canterbury Tales? Anyone read that in high school or here at Marist? If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's quite good. One of the tales, the Parson's Tale, has a discussion of this. William Langland in Piers Plowman, one of the very early, quite famous Middle English poetry. He has a parade of the 7 deadly sins. John Gower has this Confessio Amantis where he actually organizes a whole bunch of stories he took from everybody else. He didn't actually make up anything himself. But he organizes them according to the 7 deadly sins. So for example, avarice, he tells the story of Midas. Remember who King Midas was, anybody? Not the ear thing. You know, he had ass's ears for a while. Do you remember anything about the Midas touch? Yeah.
Everything turned into gold.
Yeah, and he asked for that because he was so greedy, and then of course he couldn't eat because he touched, food and it turned into gold, so he was unhappy. So there's a story about greed, and then he tells you a whole bunch of other stories. And what does he put under there? Jealousy, for example. Jealousy is a kind of greed of love. I want your love so much that nobody else can have it. And he goes through all of these things. There's also a really interesting poem. It's very short, called The Wounds and the Sins. And it talks about the wounds of Christ, and each one of them is a way of overcoming the 7 deadly sins. So pride corresponds to the crown of thorns. Envy corresponds to the spear that's thrust into his side. Gluttony corresponds to the gall, the crappy wine, and bitter stuff that they put on the sponge for him. Lechery or lust corresponds to his death. Wrath corresponds to the right hand nail. Greed to the left hand nail. And the nails through the feet correspond to sloth. So you see these poets using these schemes to make sense out of things, to do poetic compositions. So now we've got all these different players involved. Why aren't we talking about the 7 deadly sins all the time now? Well, in part because of the Protestant Reformation. You find Catholics continuing to talk about these things, and you do find some Protestants picking it back up later on, but it came to be seen as a distinctively Catholic thing. By the way, the 7 deadly sins are not like, a binding way of looking at everything. If you look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, you're not going to find that, it's the only way to possibly understand sin and everything is organized that way. The Catechism actually says you can look at it this way, you can look at it this way, very much like Peter Lombard. They become popularized, but in the popularization, they've kind of lost a lot of their real meaning. The real meaning resides in these compositions by the poets. If you want to know about pride or greed or something like that, read Dante, or read these scholastic authors like Thomas Aquinas. Or if you want kind of a boring read, read these confessors and their manuals, because it's very schematic. Or if you want to see what monastic life was like and what these guys were struggling against, read John Cassian. He's a fun read. I'll tell you something that's kind of funny. The edition that I have, actually, the section on lust, the translation keeps that part in Latin because they don't want any schoolboys reading it and getting any bright ideas about what you might do. This is actually a big problem with the confessors too. You can see this in the manuals of confession. You want to ask about what the person's doing, but you don't want to be very specific. You want to let them volunteer the information because you don't want to actually put any ideas in their head about what they might be doing and missing out on. So all this is really interesting reading. It's all trying to figure out these things that make human beings tick. It's very much within the pattern of not only theology but philosophy and psychology. Trying to figure out why are we screwed up? How do we get less screwed up? How can we identify these patterns? The last thing that I'll tell you about is this guy, St. John of the Cross. He was this is after the Reformation. He's what they call a counter-Reformation or a Catholic Reformation figure. He's a Carmelite. He's not a Dominican or a Franciscan or Benedictine. And he actually talks in terms of spiritual sins. And during the spiritual life, a person will be posed with the problem of committing spiritual gluttony or spiritual pride or spiritual avarice. Spiritual pride is when you go around talking about, what a spiritual person you are and how, accomplished you are in spirituality. And you actually believe this sort of thing, and it keeps you from actually progressing. So it's a long story with a lot of different threads. There's a lot of research still yet to be done here. And I don't know if I've given you an organized enough tale for this to fully make sense to you. But at the very least, now we know why there were originally 8 and how there came to be 7, and why people came to feel that 7 is the number that we want to stick with. There's a lot of other things we could have gone off on and explored, but I want to leave a little bit of time for any questions or comments, interjections that you might have about this sort of stuff. Yeah.
So when you mentioned that the levels in purgatory were referenced by the 7 sins, did it also have a correspondence with the crosses that were put on Dante's head when he entered purgatory? And as he ascended up each level, one of the crosses would disappear. Is there any association between that and the sins?
Well, I mean, that's something that's happening. That's a good question. I mean, is it like there's a...
Is like a sin being purged off each time?
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't say like, and then the cross of lechery left, or the cross of greed left, or something like that. But yeah, that's a way to interpret it. I'm not a Dante scholar myself. I have to just go by what they tell me.
I haven't read it in a long time, so I'm like.
It's a good question. And you could ask, why does Dante actually have? He's not actually being purged the way that the people in there are being purged. He's being shown this stuff, but he is being purified by their example. And if you read it, it's crazy stuff they're going through. The people who are, being purged of anger. I always pay attention to anger because that's my biggest problem to struggle with. They got to walk around in fumes and they can't see anything. And just imagine the worst campfire ever that you've been at, where smoke is in your eyes constantly for 100 years or 1,000 years. And groping around. The people who are gluttonous, they can't actually eat anything. They're stuck there. They're like Tantalus. They reach out for fruit and it zips away. And they're like, I should have known. I'm not going to get to eat anything. The people who are slothful, they got to work all the time. They're running around. But Dante doesn't have to. He's witnessing that.
He's got to express it.
He's got. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. What else? What else are you curious about or irritated about?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I'm curious about curiosity. Curiosity.
Oh, for answer.
Yeah, right. It seems like nobody else really picks that up.
Yeah. That's a more Augustinian way of looking at this sort of stuff.
And it's true. We think of that now as a
good thing.
Yeah. Right. As a virtue.
Yeah. When these guys are talking about curiosity, they're not saying that you shouldn't be interested in thinking about it. But there's being curious about stuff that doesn't really concern us at all, is none of our business, and doesn't help us out to find out about. And there's been a lot of discussions lately about whether social media contributes to this, also to Acedia, by the way. Whether social media makes us more curious about other people's lives in kind of non-edifying ways than we ought to be. There's enough good things to be curious about that we don't have to. Here's the understanding: we don't have to spend our time with these other things. But this curiosity thing is coming. There's a 3-part distinction. Pride is the beginning of these, and then you have delectatio, sort of illicit pleasures and things. You have curiosity, and then you have exaltatio, sort of raising oneself above other people. Anselm used that as his way of describing these. He knew about the 7 deadly sins, but he just didn't seem to think they mattered. And there were other people, like St. Bernard. St. Bernard talks about pride and vainglory and envy, and then that's it. He He doesn't buy the rest of the ordering of the sins. He's got enough other ways to think about sins. There's quite a few people. Abelard doesn't use it. Augustine and Jerome, of course, don't use it, but they probably didn't know about Cassian stuff. Ambrose doesn't use it. It really, I think that the reason why it took hold so strongly ought to be attributed to these confessors in their manuals. Because even Thomas Aquinas, his treatment of it is kind of standoffish. You know, you could look at the sins this way, or you could look at them this way, or you could look at them this way. There's no internal necessity for them, the way there is for these confessors.
So it seems like curiosity like it's somewhat, at least in Anselm, sort of at least related to distraction, because it kind of presupposes that there's too much for you to know anyway.
I tried to fit Anselm in here. I don't know if it's really successful.
No, I'm glad you did.
So Acedia is this allowing oneself to be distracted. Alcuin has this great metaphor of, and this is his real contribution to the discussion of it, it actually like physically throwing the monk out of his room and making him go around and like, what's that guy doing over there? Anything but focus on himself and his own spiritual progress and what he's supposed to be doing. You know how it is when you got an assignment and you really don't feel like doing that assignment and you know you really need to? You'll find anything whatsoever else to do. You'll like clean up your room, you'll organize your notebooks, you'll go into your pictures and like, maybe I should make an album, you'll call other people, maybe do a little research, but it's not actually research that's going to help you out on the assignment. That's Acedia. That's exactly what they're describing there. So the curiosity in Anselm's sense, I thought could kind of fit that. Any other questions or concerns? Go ahead.
Just one last thing. Like, it seems like, just to go from the beginning to the end, that what happens to move it down to 7 is that sort of pride sort of takes over vainglory.
Yeah.
So that's
it kind of absorbs it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It varies. Some people are saying pride is the root of all of these, like Thomas Aquinas. Pride is or not the root. Pride is the beginning of all these. Greed is actually the root of all of them, and they all come in here. Different people organize them different ways, like which one's more serious than the other. Usually pride is at the top and gluttony or lust are at the bottom because they're carnal rather than spiritual sins. They're the body rather than the soul. But they vary in which one's worse, gluttony or lust. Some people are thinking lust is worse, some people are thinking gluttony is. I can tell you this, the monks thought that unless you actually tackle gluttony, you can't do any of the rest of them. You have to engage in fasting at a bare minimum to tackle any of the sins for monks. If you look at Thomas Aquinas, it doesn't look like he thought so. Big little guy, He might have gland problems though too.
Yeah, of course.
Really know.
Of course.
But I don't think he missed a lot of meals.
So why are they deadly?
Oh, because they tend to produce the kinds of things that will be mortal sins, will lead to spiritual death.
Eventually.
Well, sooner or later. I mean, if you have a real solid anger problem, it's not going to take long before somebody sets you off. Same thing if you're envious. And if you think about these, they're all ways of being subject to something else. Even pride. With pride, you think it's like I'm greater than everything else. You're stuck with your own self-image, your own ego, and you can't get away from it. That's a terrible way to be. Anger is a horrible thing to carry around with you all the time. Sadness, even. It's interesting that these monks thought that dejection, being despairing, was actually something that could lead you to screw things up. Well, I thank you for your time and your attention, and yeah, that's it.